Hello, everyone, and welcome to OYO Run, the online resource for the self-coached runner. This week, I am joined again by Carl Stones. Good to see you, Carl.
Yeah, good to be back.
And I'm excited because one of the things I suggested was getting your perspective on the episode, the short episode I recorded of On the Leash episode, which I called Borrowed Truths, the ultimate leash. And I just wanted to get your perspective as both a PT and thinking through the various aspects of a human body's borrowed truths, or the human body's limitations, or even constraints that we're dealing with that need some level of engagement from the athlete in order to better set up or better influence their ability to perform at a higher level. Okay, I made that a little bit weirdly weird verbiage there, but I think I think we've already set up enough frame here for you to be able to roll with that.
Yeah. It made sense to me.
Cool. So, I guess what I'd like to just start with is tell me what your perspectives are related to the idea of borrowed truth. Like, just, as an athlete human, like as a person who has been an athlete and as a human generally, and then we can kind of steer it in the direction of what are we thinking about from the human body perspective, and or a therapeutic or injury mode. We've got a couple of different, variations on the theme that we could proceed with.
Yeah, I think that, I hadn't really heard it or thought of it from the terminology of borrowed truths. And I think we talked a little bit. I tend to, maybe have seen it more as, what's my bias toward things? What do I, but I kind of like borrowed truths a little more because I think bias can be a little bit, I don't know, sometimes a little bit scientific and researchy in my mind. But I think it's just, what are our, what are the principles that we operate on, or what are the things that we, believe to be important? What are the things that we, focus on in regards to whether things are going right, or whether things are going wrong? What are we attributing that to? And, it's, and then, depending on what your bias is or your borrowed truth, how amenable are you to change that and to take feedback on it and kind of move forward. So I think it's, just the framework that we use to, and we all have to have one, but that drives your personal experience with running or whatever, hobby or pastime it is.
When I introduce this concept to my athletes in one-on-one conversations, frequently they react negatively because they're either distrustful of truth in general. There's a postmodern sort of theme that most of us have come through, either being through our own education, if you're old like me, or like you, who has been educated by educators who are thinking about a post-truth or a relative truth world in which it's important for different voices and diversity of voices and opportunity and options to be out there in the world. This idea that there's some sort of stated truth or overarching truth is problematic. And then they're also challenged by the term borrowed, because I don't want to be, what do you mean I borrow it? I'm a self-sufficient, unique human being that's able to make decisions, and I'm not like just being drug along by my heels, by my culture or by my beliefs or whatever. And I would say that's absolutely fundamentally untrue, because ultimately we cannot operate as a complex nervous system without so many things are happening in the world. So many things are happening just in your going from a seated position, standing up, walking to the restroom, going to the restroom, coming back, sitting back down. What we have going on there is so much truth. I'm borrowing this word here. Now I'm mixing my metaphors, but I'm using that just to say, hey, you're not aware and conscious of all of the things that are happening under the hood. And another way to frame this is to think of this as signal to noise, that there's a lot of noise everywhere that we are, but the way we're operating is to focus our attention and to focus our awareness on signals, things that are important to us or things that are important out there in the world. And so we have to just take it. These truths or this noise, we have got to recognize it's there. My audio essay, that the piece I did on the leash, is not to make us feel bad, but to help us recognize you are responsible for all that, for the way you respond to all that noise. Whether or not you're responsible for it, that's something working with borrowed truths can help. Working with clear signal can help. But ultimately, you're in a noisy place, or you're in a space in which many, many truths are playing out, whether they're gravitational from physics, from evolutionary history, from worldviews, from political structures to education. I mean, pedagogical things. I mean, there's so many levels of this that we can't take all that information in. And then also that information is necessary. So I do always try to walk the athlete back into a space of ownership. And that's really what I would like this episode to do, is like, what are the things that we think are most important for the athlete to own in their physical structure? And then what might be some of the sort of obvious borrowed truths that many people are using. And we'll probably unpack this through a different format, some of these other questions, because you and I already had we've already done some planning around various aspects of this that we think are really important, through specifics like, do you lift with shoes on or barefoot? We've already had a couple of conversations around, hey, there's a truth out there that's being propagated in the world, but it's not necessarily actually true. And what's most important is for you as an athlete to spend some time and with what's going on. And so, yeah, so I'll stop there. I just diatribed and did a whole section that's almost as long as the original section I did on borrowed truth. But I do think when I did that, I structured it in such a way that it was more in that vein of presentation of concept rather than discussion. And that's why I'm excited today to kind of discuss whatever directionality we want to go with it.
Yeah, I think it's a hard, I think, concept to for anybody to take. I mean, like you said, take ownership on it. I think because it requires that you're taking some accountability for what's going on and what's happening in your training. And even with the greatest coach in the world, it's not their responsibility for, to necessarily oversee how you are interpreting everything that's going on. A coach can help you with that. A lot of different people can help you with that. But it does require, some amount of accountability. And that's hard because when, we want these cookie cutter, we want there to be a clear cut answer and a clean answer, and we want it to be in that black or in the white. But, if you can't exist in the gray, you might get lucky for a little while. But you're not going to, it's going to break down at some point.
Yeah. And in this analogy that I'm using with borrowed truth, it's like start with the gray and then just determine what is more or less gray, if that's as far as we go. Or do we actually have the ability to move into something that might be actually considered a truth or a falsity? And then what I think what's happened there is that you've interrogated your own experience, not from a place of lack, but start with the gray. Like start with what am I actually experiencing and what do I actually think? And then work through that. One great one here is something I think is so important for people is weekly volume. This idea of weekly volume by itself, it's a borrowed truth that the more mileage you run in a 7-day cycle, the faster you're going to be. And you and I can break that. We can defang that through a variety of different methods. But it is pointing to a truth, which is the greater number of opportunities and duration and or distance that you spend in an aerobic zone, the likelihood, assuming you stay healthy, the likelihood you're going to be more aerobically developed, which is a very beneficial piece of the puzzle. Yep. So the truth is, more volume is good, but is it true for you based on a variety of other constructs? Like, are you doing a lot of quality? How many days of the week do you run? And then let's just talk about the arbitrary nature of just the fact that we have to deal with a 7-day cycle, because our work day is a 7-day cycle. So we think in 7 days. What if we did it over 10 days? What if you did that over, what if you said, how many miles can I run in a month? You and I both know that if an athlete was focused on how many miles they ran in a month as their truth and just got a numerical, as we're saying, black and white, they're getting a white signal from that truth, that number would be probably more valuable. Let's just say somebody's running 50 miles a week, right? 200 miles in a month is probably a better number if you're going to use numbers, because it'll be fluctuating over 28 days or 31 days. So now the athlete has to think about that, be in their body. So anyway, so maybe we can just use this as an initial pointer of like, look, you need to decide for yourself what your weekly volume is and what that truth is, starting with the place that is, the more miles you run, the better. But where does that work for you?
Yeah. And I mean, we have, there is some good, not necessarily like a randomized control trial necessarily, but when we look at, across the board, elite athletes and, the faster people are, there is a relationship to the volume that they run. I think that that is probably more important. You took it out to a month. I could take it out to, a career, a competitive career. So it's really the miles that you run across your competitive career. I think that that's hard for people because it's not, that's something you can't chew. I can't sit here, I wouldn't sit down as a 15-year-old starting to run cross country and say, okay, I need to run this many 1,000 miles between, now and in the fall of 2004 and the Olympic trials in 2016, because that's overwhelming. I'm going to grab Andy.
Yes, if she wants of course.
To join for a second. But, I think that the week is, if we wanted to say that it was beneficial, I think that you can make an argument that it's beneficial, just from the standpoint that it gives us some control over it. And it's easier to say, okay, instead of worrying about that, I know that, I need to be in this ballpark. And so if I need to run 50 miles in a week and I'm running, 6 days a week, I need to be, at or around an average of 8 miles with maybe a slightly longer long run, or 7 miles with a slightly longer long run. And I think that that's beneficial because, maybe some people could handle that career view. But most people need that step back where it's just kind of, okay, at what level can I control it? But I think where it's really beneficial, the more that you step that out is, I mean, if you need to be at 50 miles a week, I don't know. I mean, does that a failure if you hit 49 one week and 51 another week? And I think that's where we kind of are bad. We attach to these relatively arbitrary values, because even that, it's what does that mean to you? Why is it 50 miles a week? Because we can't really, we get feedback on it, as we go through and we say, okay, I was doing 50 miles a week and I was running pretty well and I stayed healthy. So that was maybe an all right amount. But what's to say that couldn't have happened at 60, and maybe you get better at 60. Or, or from a diminishing return standpoint, maybe it could have been 45. You could have gotten 99% of the benefit and, felt better, stayed healthier at 45 a week on average, or whatever time span we want to look at. So yeah, I think mileage is a good one because it's such a common, and I've been guilty of that. I still struggle with it. Like this morning I was finishing my run and I was like, I'm going to be at 6.7 miles. And, if I go around the block, I can get to 7. But I was kind of tired and I was like, no, I'm just going to go home. That's not going to, if I miss, a third of a mile because I was just a little bit lazy this morning, that's, if I really care about it, I can make it up tomorrow, and probably doesn't really matter that much. So,
yeah, that's a great story because I had this experience many, many, many years ago when I was coaching at Rogue, where in a podcast, I railed against people gerbling. That's what I call that term of what you just described, of trying to go around in a little like a little gerbil in a hamster.
Wheeling.
Yes, hamster wheeling. For some reason, I called it a gerbil, and then that gerbling sounds better than hamstering. But I know that they're different. They're taxonomically different. But anyway, then I had an athlete push back on me and say, you don't understand why that number of 7 is important. Psychologically, I feel like I have accomplished something. And if I do 6.7, I don't feel like I accomplished something. So I want to highlight this as an example of that athlete having now a truth, not a borrowed truth, but a real truth that they could then come back to their coach and say, hey, don't denigrate my experience because it is actually something I find to be very important. And once it was framed by her in that context, I immediately stepped back from it and said, oh no, that is more important than my sort of giving you grief about tacking on, because that's my personal truth. Just like you figured out that, oh, I don't need the 7, I can go to 6.7. Today that's true, but there may be another day where it's not, or tomorrow it may be, I went 6.7, I'm going to do 7.3 just so I can keep it an even clean thing. The key thing here is the borrowed aspect. We have to borrow things because we can't keep everything in our skulls. We can't, and then also 50 miles a week is an organizational benefit, okay? It's organizationally beneficial, as you described. But does that make it true? Then you just say, okay, let my organization, my miles per week or my miles per day or whatever that sit within the greater truth of what I'm trying to accomplish. Whether that's getting in 7 miles or for the athlete that wants the completionist that's feeling that mental lift that's coming from this accomplishment that is, we know from a nervous system perspective, exactly what we're trying to train when we're training, because we've got both the mind and the body aligned equally with a thing. So, I think it's a good example of how the borrowing is essential, but getting truth helps the athlete benefit more from the work they're doing.
Yeah, I think that I would agree with. I think that there are times where you need that. You have to take confidence from things, and it's mileage is, for me, it was a huge confidence builder throughout my career. It's less important now, and so I have more leeway with that. But for me, there were times in my career where it was, I know that if I run this much and I run this much a day, even if I'm a little bit tired one day, I knew that was such a psychological advantage for me when I stepped on the line, because I knew, especially late in the season, it's like I've been running 110 miles a week. I've been racing on that. I haven't been stepping down, and now I'm tapering. So I knew that, I knew things were going to be good when I was rested. I think the areas where, and that can be a truth for an athlete, but I also think that it's, the psychological variable is important. The nervous system component is important, but it can't come at the cost of other things, and so you're not going to, spur on a tendinopathy or a bone stress injury or something like that, or overtraining syndrome, whatever you want to, insert in that slot. You're not going to do that, tacking on an extra. I would have been fine to tack on an extra third mile today. I could have gone an extra mile. It wouldn't have really mattered. But I do think that there are times where it's important to step back and, say, there's a range where this is okay, but it has to click with, are we doing that so often and so consistently that we are starting to kind of chip away at that armor a little bit? Are we starting to, are we running, an extra X number of miles a week on, in a really fatigued state, on really tired legs and a tired mind, and that's where, it can be a truth for you, but you probably need to understand that what is a truth today might not be your truth tomorrow. And that was, I think that kind of like we talked about a little bit, and I mentioned it earlier, it's your bias, and that's fine. We all have them. But, if you are presented with evidence to the contrary of your bias, can you accept that? And can you make changes where you need to make changes? Because I think that, whether it's a truth or a borrowed truth, I won't be able to remember who it, you never step in the same river twice, because it's not the same river when you step in it, and you're not the same person when you step in it. So things are always changing. And you don't want to micromanage that, because that's you're probably introducing way too much. Speaking of noise, you're probably introducing way too much noise there, where it's tough to interpret that signal. But it's hard, and I think that it's finding the right, it's finding the right zoom on your camera. You don't want to be too close, where you're missing the forest, for the trees, but you don't want to be too far either, and kind of hyper analyzing every single thing. So when you were kind of talking about some of that, it's almost like you need a framework, and I think that frameworks are great. You need a mileage range. I enjoyed, in your conversations with Michael about your kind of A, B, and C goals, and I think that having a framework roughly around what you want to do, because if you don't have that, then it's just total chaos. How do you evaluate anything? And how do you know that you're even in the right ballpark? But if you don't have that flexibility, you run the risk of going in every day and forcing a square peg through a round hole.
When I initially came up with this term borrowed truth, I started with the idea of belief, and that was it is a less it's a less strong word, right? Truth sits in some sort of absolute realm, whereas belief, though I do think the reason why I chose truth was because I think belief is in the same realm, that people tend to think there's more fluidity and flexibility around it, right? And I think there is, but I also think that might be towards other people's beliefs, but not necessarily towards your own belief. But I do think this idea of thinking of truth more in a context of belief, you may be in a position where that ability to step forward or back from a particular metric, or recognize a day where an additional day of rest and recovery might be beneficial, as opposed to getting that, that will push a 7-day cycle out. And so you might have 7, if you're doing 7 miles a day, that may give you a 43-mile week instead of a 50-mile week. But the next week you might be able to go up to 57, or you might feel much better in all the work that you did. Again, these things, we're using this as an analogy, this idea of, or as an example, this idea of mileage. But let's take something more, a little bit different, and that would be the exercises an athlete might choose to do in a weight routine, okay? Because this is another place where, if you look at the literature, I mean, you get overwhelmed by the number of lifts that an athlete, a distance runner, should do, or that I need to do something that's going to make my glutes fire. You and I have had multiple conversations around this particular topic, and so I think it might be useful for our listeners to hear your perspective on this from a borrowed truth when you're taking it into your prehab, rehab, and or strength training modalities. How do you sort of frame this, and whether that goes into these categories or in an overall framing? How would you suggest an athlete go about thinking about this?
Yeah, I think that, this is I think everything can kind of be a hairy conversation around running because there's so many different options. But from a lifting standpoint or a rehab standpoint, I think that, there's no shortage of opinions or protocols or this is what you need to do or that's what you need to do, whether that's from from maybe the initial concept of, do you need to do it at all? And so usually you kind of have to figure out what somebody believes, or what their borrowed truth is as it pertains to lifting. And I have a little bit of an advantage here where I can kind of skip a step, because if somebody's coming to me talking about that, then they've thought about introducing it. Like I'm not coaching athletes, and I'm not, from a running standpoint, I'm not in that realm. And so I'm not trying to convince people that that's something important. So if somebody's coming to me with, then they're at least amenable to it. I think starting there and kind of getting an idea of, what are your, what are your preconceived notions on this? What are your borrowed truths as it pertains to lifting? Whether that's just lifting, whether it's, not, as it would support your running, or whether it's something where you're saying, I know that this is something that's beneficial. Why do you feel that is? I think that it's beneficial. That's my bias. But what does that mean to you? And then kind of going from there, I think that, some of the things that I see people, the common, I don't want to call them misconceptions, because they are, I don't want to dismiss somebody's truths necessarily. But this worry that you're going to put on too much muscle. You're going to put on too much weight, which, I don't like getting into the conversation of how much people weigh, because that's I don't know, that's a maze. But I think that starting there, if somebody's worried about that, and then I can take those worries and I can talk through it a little bit, and ideally in small steps, and not just totally violating somebody's worldview. I think that that's important. Whether it's lifting or anything else, politics, it doesn't really matter. But once somebody is willing to listen to you, or to hear your perspective, or maybe your own borrowed truths or biases, then I think that that's helpful. So that's one thing, is kind of taking those, like, I'm worried that this is going to make me bulky. I'm worried that it's going to, affect how my legs feel. It's going to add, additional fatigue where I don't really want it. And I already feel like I'm, juggling this redlining in my training and doing all this stuff. So I think the biggest thing for me, my own borrowed truths or otherwise with lifting is that, I view it as something to be very ancillary to your running. It's meant to be supportive. It's not meant to, the goal when you come to me or to anybody and you're saying, here's my race goal or here are my running goals, and I want to move closer to that by adding in lifting. If we totally miss your running goal, but we add 10 pounds to your bench, you probably don't care that much about that. So I think that making sure that's one of mine is this should be supportive of your running. It should not detract from it. It might make you a little bit tired early on when you're getting used to it. But overall, big picture, it's going to kind of expand your capacity to handle these different things. So that's one. And then we kind of look at, what's your time commitment? What do you have? Are you operating on a trust fund where you don't have to go to work? You don't have any kids, you have all this time to recover. You're getting enough, you have the ability to get enough nutrition to fuel these goals. Great. That's one thing. But maybe that's not it. Maybe you've got 2 kids and you've got a full-time job and you're the only way that you're squeezing your running in is at, 5 in the morning. 4 in the morning. And then what time do we have? Do you have to go to a gym? Do you have a home gym? So I think that these are all things that kind of influence that truth. And it can be where I think it's the most challenging is when it's honestly pretty easy if people have the time and resources and capacity, physical capacity to add in 2 lifting days on top of their running without changing anything. The harder conversation is, I don't have any time. I'm kind of maximizing my time with running right now. Is it beneficial if we take away, 40 minutes of running to substitute with 40 minutes of lifting? And so I think that those are more than, what exercises you need to do. Those are really the important, truths that you have to establish with yourself before you even take that on. And then from there, once we have that kind of nailed down and, what can we commit to it? What are you willing to do? Then it becomes easy because it's a little bit of injury history. But regardless of injury history, I can 80 or 90% of lifting plans can be very similar. And I think that they can be pretty boring and they can be pretty short and effective. And so it's that conversation of, it probably doesn't matter that much if you're weighing the options between heavy back squats and Bulgarian split squats and step ups, it doesn't matter that much. Just, pick the one that you enjoy the most, that you are going to tackle, that you're more likely to do, and start there. And then we can, as those truths evolve and as other doors open, and we can kind of have a conversation around something else that might work. And so it is very individual, but not in the way that I think people, not in that you need this really complex assessment to say that you're going to benefit more from doing a back squat and a hip thrust than you are from doing a split squat and a deadlift. Those things are a little bit more, I think, arbitrary than people tend to think. I'm borrowing this term from a physical therapist named Greg Lehman, but I try to be a little bit more of a movement optimist. And that, I don't really believe that there's any such thing as a bad exercise, but I think that there are, certain exercises that are probably more worth your while at any given time, that may move your needle a little bit more in that direction. So, if you love doing clamshells on the ground, cool. I like that. You're probably not going to get as much carryover into your running as you would, loading up some heavier deadlifts and squats. Right. But it's, that can be a tough one because there are so many, people do come in with so many, whether they believe it or not, so many strong borrowed truths as to what that means for them and what it should look like and how beneficial it is.
I mean, you just nailed what my point of view on this is, and thank you for that whole, the way you wove that through, because you just basically came back to where you started, which is that, well, I'll just say it, so many people's truths are borrowed from magazines, YouTube videos, somebody who's an expert, or watching what the Bowerman Group is doing or some collegiate program is doing, and then thinking I can just glom that onto what I am and where I am. And again, I don't want to dismiss the potential benefits of curiosity, exploration, wanting to try new things, and wanting to be the best. And so you're taking information from the best to be the best. But when I was a kid, I used to read this thing called How They Train. It's like from the 60s and 70s. Fred Wilt wrote this thing, and in it is basically what used to be in the back of the Runner's World magazine, which was from the training log of X, right? Yeah. And you would see the workouts and what they did. And, as a young person, the younger I was, the more I was like, oh, that workout. What would it be like to do that workout? Of course, I was 14 or 15. I wasn't going to do Mark Nenow's 10-mile run at 10 o'clock at night every night. But I was immensely intrigued by this guy who's probably the best 10,000 meter runner in the U.S. and one of the top in the world at that time in the early 80s, doing most of his work on a road in the evening, and almost always 10 miles. And then he would do easy runs on other times, but it was so generic and simple. But what I could do later is to take the truth of that and say, okay, what part of that freedom and flexibility, as opposed to other people that were doing 10 times 10 miles or what's going on now with lactate, doing lactate testing in the moment. Again, I'm not poo-pooing those ideas. What I'm saying is what is so exciting to you, and where are you getting your information from, and then do what is exciting, and then bring that into some level of consistency so you can get a truth from it. Because until you listen to a lot of noise, you're not going to know what the signal is in this idea of signal to noise.
I've always thought that's, I've kind of thought about that too, and I've struggled with this just because I'm so interested in the different ways that the different programs we have, there are so many different ways to, looking at what, I can't remember if I think it was Peter Snell, running when you run 144 on a grass track, which I think is
not in super shoes. Yes.
No, not in super shoes and on a grass track. And when I look at that, I'm kind of like, man, I still don't know if there's a more impressive running feat than that. I think,
agree.
And it's hard for people to understand, but, his training methods at the time, which were, Lydiard, really pure Lydiard. And then contrasting that with, Jakob or whoever else now is doing, taking finger prick measurements every single time that they run a rep, to the, the East African and the Kenyans, which is just everything is on feel. And it's, and I think, there's nothing wrong with any of those systems, but I think that where I've always had trouble is I get excited about something and I'm like, oh yeah, I want to try the double threshold, right? And then you do it for a little bit and then you read about, you're like, oh, Percy Sarity trained on sand dunes. It's like, you need to go find some sand and do some, sand volleyball sprints. And then I think, again, you could get lucky and find the perfect combination of those things. But a lot of it is just trying to figure out over time, what works well for you. I always got a kick out of I feel like, I don't hear it as much anymore. But I feel like when I was getting recruited in college, everybody's answer was, oh yeah, we've got some, we do some Lydiard stuff. And if you actually read Lydiard's book on training, you're kind of like, yeah, everybody does some Lydiard stuff, but nobody does Lydiard, Lydiard really doesn't work in a 3-season, from a collegiate athlete standpoint, it doesn't work in a 3-season system.
Yeah, it requires a very periodized plan in which, he was doing things he used effort-based models for everything he did. Things were half level, quarter level, 3/4 level, of which you need a translation, and then he did uphill, bounding up hills, and then a flat section where you ran fast and then you jogged back down. He did, and a lot of people don't. Yeah, Lydiard is considered volume, easy volume, or fast volume sometimes, because his long runs started out easy. But if you look at what Peter Schnell was an 800-meter runner who ran 1:44, who ran 20-mile long runs.
Yeah,
almost every Sunday. So up and down hills. Again, that's very easy to say, oh, if I want to be a fast 800-meter runner, what I need to do is go run up and down hills for 20 miles. It's like, no, it's in an entire system, and that's where those systems are important for people to utilize to gain some level of sort of even playing field for what their truth will be. So you use the system to determine this works for me, but this other part that this coach has doesn't work for me. I don't like the bounding up a hill. I have all kinds of problems with that, or I don't respond well to it, or I have significant plantar pain. So doing sand sprints at this point in time is not the best option for me in this window of time, but that might be something later. And I think that is the point I'm trying to make here relative to the borrowed truth in relation to the things we're talking about is you want to use systems. You want to use, if you're coached, you want to use a system. You want to use that coach's system and then determine what works in their system for you, what doesn't, and that becomes your truth. And then you let that truth run so you don't have to think about every single decision you have to make. However, when an anomaly occurs of injury or an incredible performance, can you go back through your training log and sift through those truths and find the falseness that created the poor performance or the injury, or the truth that actually created this greater optimal performance? And as a coach who's been doing this for a long time, it's very hard to pinpoint these things. They require systematic, consistent approaches of bias or noise or untruth until you're able, borrowed truth, not to say untruth, but borrowed truth, until you're able to determine your own truth. So again, I'm glad we unpacked this, because I think people are going to think I think it's a black and white thing. And what it is eventually it may end up having some black and some white, but more often than not, you're going to be in some level of gray. But that gray, I ended the episode with this point. Whatever your truth is will not be someone else's truth. That is very important. And you and I both know this, both as athletes and for me as a coach. You watching me coach, I coach 3 or 4 steeplechasers. If you add the women, I coach 7 or 8 steeplechasers. And I used a similar system for everybody, but then I tried to individualize based on that particular athlete's strengths and weaknesses, which becomes really problematic, because then somebody says, I want to do what Mary's doing, or I want to do what Carl's doing. And Carl says, I don't like any of this shit. I'm going to go do my own thing for a little while and run for Jacuzzi Boys and do my own thing because I don't understand what the heck is going on. And all of those things are part of the noise that's going on that's incredibly important for the self-coached athlete at whatever level they are to be fully aware that it is on you. The system is not going to fix it or make it right, but you have to decide what works best for you and then operate from it and do your best from there.
Well, and I mean, I struggled with that for so long. And I think that, I'm as guilty as anybody comes for that accountability standpoint, because I wanted that accountability to fall on you. Right. And it wasn't that I was in Austin, living kind of like an idiot and not, especially that first year, there were a lot of things that I convinced myself of that were okay that I was doing. That,
like late night whiskey with Scott McPherson.
Yeah, exactly. And there were a lot of things that I was like, oh yeah, no, this is fine. And the problem is that I'm not doing, averaging, 6 long tempos a month, because I knew that was what worked for me in Tulsa. But in Tulsa, I was living a very different lifestyle and I had so many things dialed in. And so, and that's one of those things, I think, one of these themes is that if maybe I'm a little bit off here, but if you're really going through this process appropriately take a borrowed truth, but you have to run with it. And I think that's, you can't operate on a borrowed truth or a workout, a system or something like that for 2 weeks and expect to find an answer. Even in the realm of injury, injury tends to be a training, injuries tend to present 6 to 8 weeks after you made a training error. And that's really hard for people, because then you attach, very few people are going back in their training log and saying what was going on, and even outside of the training log, most training logs are not, I try to make little life notes in my training log of like, Andy was up 3 times last night. Kaya came in at, 3 a.m., and making notes like that, because we're already bad about looking back 6 weeks just on the running we were doing. And then so we start to say, well, what was it? And we blame one workout, or we blame the shoes that we got the week before, or we blame like, well, I couldn't run on Town Lake. I was running on the road. So we blame the surface. And there are so many other things that are easier to blame that at the end of the day are not going to get you any, they're little, they're red herrings, and I think at the end of all of it, if you're doing it right, I think, again, maybe you get lucky and you just, follow the straight and narrow and every decision you make is right and that's perfect. But even then you wouldn't know if there was a better way because you didn't try anything else. But, you should get to the end of that road and be at a point, I feel like this all the time where I'm like, man, I wish that I knew this when I was coming out of college and joining Rogue. Like, I wish that I had this perspective. And some of that's bittersweet because I'm like, yeah, I feel like I underperformed in a lot of ways. And I wasted a lot of time strictly from a running performance standpoint. But I don't consider it wasted time because I got a lot of perspective that I've been able to sit on. Even if I didn't have it in the moment, it's more clear now. I met my wife. That's another one that I'll touch on something with that in a minute. But I think that you should be able to get through this process and say, okay, I've got these things dialed in, and I have a better understanding of my borrowed truths and where they come from and why they come from there. And maybe they feel like they're easing in, or they're transitioning to being truths. Like, I'm a little bit more in that black or the white. I'm still in the gray. I think that we all, to an extent, operate in the gray just because we don't have an understanding fully of everything that's going on under the hood at all times. But being able to say, okay, this works for me. And it's okay to then go back and say, like, it doesn't keep me up at night that I wasn't doing these things when I was 23. It's just, hey, I wish that I had known that. And then, if I might be able to provide some of that insider guidance to somebody else down the road, and that's great. But man, I can't imagine how boring it would be to just have picked the right thing every time. Like I probably would have quit running, if that was the case. It wouldn't be exciting. And I think, even just from a kind of an offshoot on how hard it is to understand everything that's going on, that that first year that I was on that team with you was probably one of the, like, relative to what I was coming off of, was probably one of the worst years that I've had from a race. I mean, just about everything. And I was consistently running like 20 seconds off my personal best in the steeple and all this stuff. But there was one race where I went out and just ran out of my mind. I didn't run a PR, but I ran, 2 seconds off. I qualified for USA's, and it seemed like, oh, it turned around, but nothing changed. Like, the training didn't change. I was still, being an idiot, but I just started dating Sarah. And so it was like, there was this, this excitement and this happiness. And that was like, what it took for me to stop running 9 minutes in the steeple as a, post-collegiate athlete and run, 8:40 and qualify for USA's. And then, and it's not, that it's not fair to lean on that for sustainment. You eventually kind of have to fall back into that personal responsibility. But I think that's, I like that example, is just like how much other things can influence your running. There were times where I was really, really straight and narrow, and I was just tired, and I was having a tough time, and I was doing the training the way that I was supposed to. And, I just happened to have a friend who was like, hey, come out with us tonight. And I was like, all right, so whatever. I'm, frustrated, and, go out and have a good time and get 3 hours of sleep and wake up. And the next morning was like the best I felt on a run in 2 months, and you're like, well, that shouldn't really make sense, right? That doesn't fall really in the framework of like, I didn't get enough sleep. I didn't get enough calories from the right thing. And then, how do we kind of implement that into our views? But I think at the end of the day, it's really important to know what your truths are and what your biases are. And it's important to sit with those and not hyperanalyze them, but sit with them and be consistent with them. And then, like you said, whatever your reevaluation period is, if it's a year, if it's, race by race, whatever that is, I think, in a lot of ways, the longer the better, as far as evaluating that. Sometimes you need it a little shorter if you feel like you're straying pretty far off the course. But that's, how do you tie that neatly into an answer for somebody? Like, you can't. It's really on that person to take those chances, to sit with that, and then decide, hey, this is working for me, or hey, this is not working for me, or whatever in between.
I think the key thing that you're highlighting here is that you need a record, of some form of record in which you can track these kinds of things, because, as you said, we're not entirely reliable narrators of our own experience in a short term, but over a long term, we know that there's a lot of problems with our memory of how things operate. And the key thing I would just suggest to folks that are listening to us and saying, well, man, you're throwing a lot of spaghetti on the wall and I'm not really sure exactly what's sticking. I would say the main thing that we're trying to say is that it's not cookie cutter, but you need some kind of cookie cutter plan initially to start with. And then you need to iterate and explore and iterate and get. That doesn't mean that you sit in a hermetically sealed box and just follow the plan that's written, but it also means that you give a plan enough time for some kind of truth or falsity to show up in your space.
Yeah.
and then listen to what your body has to tell you and what your body has to say. One of the things I repeat in that audio piece on the leash is just how I know that in the essence, I think a truth will sit in your blood and your bones and in your breath. Like there will be a deep inner knowing that is both, someone might call spiritual if they're entitled, if they're moving in that direction, but it could also just be, instinctual and or intuitive knowledge of what is right in your space. And then look for the anomalies. I think this is the real key, because anything good and quality needs variation, and that the variation is there to create an anomalous experience. That can be anomaly in a good sense or an anomaly in a bad sense, and then you iterate and operate based on that. But what's key here is that you keep a record so that you're able to follow through with this. And that record is not your Strava data. It's some kind of reflection that you're doing, whether that's mental training processes or just tracking your own stuff. One thing I like to ask my athletes to do, which I think is really good, is each time before I meet them every 2 weeks, I meet most of my athletes every 2 weeks online, I'll ask them just to send me a review of their training. And I tell them, I don't want your Strava data. You can link it in there if you want, but I'll only look if there's an anomaly. So link it in there, but I'm only really looking for what went awesome, because I can circle that and say, okay, that's something we want to think about. And what went horribly, okay, let's circle that. Let's see what it is. Now, I'm not going to react to either one of those things and suddenly change the whole schedule because something went well or something went poorly. But I am going to say, this is what I want to track. And somebody might say, well, then what you're doing in the middle doesn't matter. And I'm like, no, it's the middle that creates the opportunity for the anomalous activity to occur in which you can track. So anyway, it's a lot there for people. I think if you're self-coaching, the key thing, I think, is you're working towards truths that will change, just like beliefs change, unless it's your worldview. But these are not worldviews. This is more about what's working for you. And you know that if it's 75 degrees and 98% humidity, like we had the other day, and one of my athletes had their biggest marathon workout, and they go in with the attitude of, I must run the paces that I'm going to run on race day. And, they laugh after and they go, there's no way I should have made a more of a concrete affected adjustment at the beginning. And it's like, and then they're feeling a little bit bad about it. I'm like, no, but you got another thing from it. So you got an adaptation to the heat and humidity. You got an ability for you to find what's real and true for you. It's like nothing is bad. The only thing that's bad is if you don't learn from the thing that happened. Your failures are essential, but they only become a successful fail if you learn from it and use it. And again, you might make the same fail 5 times before you learn, but all 5 of those times are successful fails if you're aware and cognizant of them, because they will change a behavior that can become a new truth for you, and whatever the case may be. And for this athlete, it's just like, hey, 75 degrees with 98% humidity, we need to adjust. What do we adjust? I don't know. That's hard to say, but let's use X. But again, if you don't track that, if you don't say, okay, what the heat and humidity is, what the run I'm trying to do, it's like, and again, you don't have to write these long extended essays, and you don't need a 20-page data sheet on your Excel spreadsheet that correlates all these other things. If that's your jam, go for it. But you do need to be able to follow along with what's going on, or else it's just going to continue to be your own borrowed truth, not based on any reality whatsoever, So
Yeah.
Anyway, there's a lot. I think there's enough there for people to to work with and operate with that can be helpful. But, I get all excited about it, and I get, kind of ranty about it, not because I think people are doing things wrong, but instead that I think so many people are doing things right, and they're not extracting the beneficial value of the really amazing things that they're doing.
Yeah. I think that's, I would be in full agreement. And I think that it has to, at the end of the day, it has to come from you. Again, you can have people or things that help you make sense of your experience. And I think that's fine. But if you're drawing your truths from your Koros data or your Strava data or, you know, what your coach is telling you, or what your, you know, it doesn't matter. It really, it's setting you up to fail at some point. And without, you know, and failure is okay. It's a great teacher if you let it be. But it's hard to learn from those failures when all of the information you're taking is from your Strava and what your Strava is telling you, or what other people are doing on Strava. You know, I think that that's where people kind of run amok a little bit, is just, you know, at the end of the day, it has to come from you, and you have to have some level of accountability. And it's okay, more than okay, if your borrowed truth ends up being wrong. But you have to be able to pivot, you know, when it's important to do so, or when it's necessary to do so, or when you're, you know, faced with overwhelming evidence against that. And that's, you know, that's okay, as long as you can do that. That's, you know, being human.
Yeah, it's problematic not if your borrowed truth is false, but if your truth is false. Yep. And either way, you have an opportunity. So either way, it's an opportunity. And what is that opportunity but to change? And that, I think, is the hardest part for many people, is that they want something more set. And again, it's very valuable for our nervous systems and our belief structures to keep things in a pattern, because those patterns help us read what we need to read. But again, it's those anomalous things that happen that are so valuable for us to track and watch. And if you're just stuck in if you're just stuck in a space in which it's always borrowed truth from some other place and some other people, or you're so locked, as you said early on, in that bias aspect of your truth, not having that flexibility to shift and change and be in an interchangeable space, you're probably somewhere in a zone of a zone of stupidity, or a zone of, you're looking at this, what is that they say? The only thing, just doing the same thing over and over again is a recipe for, well, I forget what it is, but you know, it's, we need to find that appropriate balance between knowing and not knowing, between having stability and allowing that uncertainty and trouble and issues to show up. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the one thing that I think is really, really important for people to be aware of is borrowed truths don't hold up under the duress of a late race struggle at whatever distance. So it's only a truth that's in your blood and bone and breath is going to actually help you through. And so even if you're looking at these things from the perspective of, I'm following my coach's system, I've got a system that's already in play, and I'm going to stick with that as consistently as possible and learn as I can, you need to be aware that they do not run for you. They do not run with you. And you're going to need that truth that they have told you you're training for to hold up in your blood and bone and breath for it to actually play out on race day. Because you're not going to, if it's easy, you're going to be fine. But no one races. Remember, you're racing into the unknown. Almost every single race is people racing into the unknown. So, you know, if that's the case, then your truths need to be operative, and then you need to be flexible enough to work with them as they play.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, there's going to come a point in time when you're, you know, naked on stage by yourself, and you have to figure out how you're going to get through that. So yeah, I think that, you know, you have to have some belief in what you're doing, even if you're not sure if that's, you know, ultimately what you want to do. Or if that's ultimately going to be a truth. I think that you have to have enough belief that you'll actually see it through and let yourself discover whether it was was this just a borrowed truth or was it a truth? Because you might stumble on the right system, but if you don't believe, and you don't give it a chance, you're never going to know. Because if you, a truth is great, but if you don't believe in that truth, it doesn't matter.
Well, it's not a truth.
Yeah.
At that point, it's not. At that point, it's not. Yes.
Yeah.
That's why when I work with athletes, I'm always like, listen, I have a system. I'm not saying my system is the right system, but you have to believe in the system and give it some time. And then somebody will ask me, well, how long will it take? I'm like, well, you should know within 3 to 4 months, but if you want to be optimal in the system, it does take about 18 months to figure out if it actually works for you. They're like, what? And I'm like, well, that's just because there's going to be a lot of nuance and variety, and I create variety in my plan because I know that's the way we optimize, and it might take you 18 months. 3 or 4 marathon cycles if you're a marathoner, 5 or 6 different race cycles if you're running shorter distances in order to determine what the quality workout is trying to exhibit and give you, what you're benefiting from, how it plays out. I think a lot about when I would take us all up to that crazy cross-country course up north in North Austin that was really, really hilly. And there was a subset of the group of people that were never going to get that absolute benefit from that work because all they could ever say was, it's too hilly, it's too hard, I can't run fast. And you're like, well, we're not running fast. What we're doing is running up these really hard, nasty hills and designing to create a lot of other pieces that I wasn't effectively articulating to them about why it was valuable. But an athlete like you who was paying attention to what was going on says, oh, wait, there's something else going on here that's going to really benefit me. Or a Chris Gohl who's just like, I just do what Steve tells me to do and I don't worry about it. Like, there's 2 different sides. There's the Carl, the critical thinker, the skeptic who wants to work through and sees, oh, this is beneficial, this will help me, to the other side, which is just take the red pill and then operate and see what happens and see what goes down. And they're as long as what's going on from there is just this taking that apart to know what it's working, how it's working for you and what you're getting from it. Because that person in between who's just bitching about it is getting a quarter benefit to a half benefit from a workout that you and Chris were getting a full benefit from.
I think I love that the most just because I couldn't be analytical. I couldn't look at it and say, well, I was running this pace for every K that we did, or for this tempo that we did on the course, or these Ks, 800s, whatever. I don't know. We did a few, but it totally removed that. And so it shifted me to an area that I know now is really beneficial for me, which is what was my effort? How did I feel? How did my body feel? How did my form hold up when I was fatigued? And it didn't matter if I was running 215 for an 800 or if I was running 240, because the course took that away, took that ability to interpret away, and it was all effort. And that was, when I had my success at Tulsa, that's what it was. It was like, I'm not really going to pay attention to the time. I'm just going to go and I'm going to run this on effort. And that effort should, it should change. I think that, if you run into the exact same thing every single time you train, if you get tired at mile 20 every single time that you run the marathon and you feel the same way, you're dealing with an expectancy issue. You're not dealing with, a physiological issue. And you have to be able to look back and say, well, what's causing that, right? Because it should change. It should change every day. It should change every month based on how much stress you have at work and how much sleep you're getting and what the conditions were. And I think that a lot of people, I see that a lot with pain, when I'm working with not just runners, but people in the clinic who it's like, I get to 130 every single day and that's when my back hurts. And I said, do you sleep the same amount and eat the exact same thing and have the exact same stress level and do the exact same thing every single day up until 130? And they're like, no. Well, then why do you think you're having the same symptom response every single time? And it's kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe I look at the clock and I start to associate that. It's like a little Pavlov thing. You've been conditioned to think that 1:30 on the clock means low back pain, and it's, that's a hard thing I mean, I struggle. You know, that's my part of my job. It's something that I still struggle with. You know, I have my own condition. You know, I've been conditioned, and I've conditioned myself in certain ways. Everybody does, but it's being able to sometimes step back from that and just recognize, yeah, maybe there's something else going on.
I mean, you just encapsulated the whole idea around borrowed truth right there in that statement, which is maybe I'm carrying something forward that's not real for me. Now you can be curious. And this is the key, I think. People are afraid to be curious. And I think that level of curiosity, because they don't see it as curious, they see it as like dismantling the stability underneath the thing that's keeping them safe. And it's not. Unless it's real, it's not going to be able to take the pressure. So you ought to be able to go back through and adjust and adapt as you're going along. And that will create a more optimal state for you in the future. It just means you're going to be in a little bit of an uncertainty space for a little while, right?
Yeah.
But again, and having other people who go through similar things is helpful too. Like keeping track of your own work, but also having training partners, if you're in a group, that you can discuss about why one person's having a very different reaction to what's going on, why another person's having another reaction, or if everybody's having the same reaction, is that a confirming your situation, or is it showing something needs to be adjusted or adapted? It's, again, I think when I said the word borrowed truth, I think a lot of people see falsity when I don't mean that. And then when I say truth, a lot of people think that that's going to be locked. And what I mean by that is curiosity. So it's actually always moving. And that's hard. That's really hard for people in our current society. I think it's always been this way for humans, but especially in the way that our lives have been so chopped up into the windows of time that we have to do the things that we have to do because of a lot of factors. And none of those are bad. Just thinking about right now, you and I are doing this podcast with your daughter in your arms, right? It's like some can consider that, oh no, in order to do a podcast, she needs to be sitting in a room, or she needs to have a babysitter or somebody else doing something. No, like that chaos, the chaos of Andy, is exactly what makes the podcast, in my opinion, makes the conversation better. I'm required to adapt and adjust to what's going on. You are as well. I don't know. I think it's really important for people to understand this aspect. I mean, I know I talk about it all the time. My athletes get crazy with it. Just uncertainty is reality. Reality is uncertain. So whatever and anytime you're creating certainty or truths, it's to regulate your nervous system. So it's good, but make sure it's real. And then it'll do what it can, but it may not be, as you said, it may not be real next week. But it may then be real again 3 weeks after that. And you just need to be able to roll with that. And that's what life is. That's how life operates. That is a truth of life. But you've got to navigate that to the best of your ability. And my main point of it all is it's a leash. It's a leash. It's holding you back. In some cases, that's for safety, because I use the dog analogy. I put a leash on my dog not to control my dog because I'm just want to choke my dog, right? Or that I want them to be constrained. It's more that in certain times and places, we need to be aware of the leashes that are there.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, cool.
It's figuring out how much leash you need.
Right. Yes, and what's appropriate. Totally. Well, thank you, Carl. This was really, I hope it was fun for me. I know it was fun for you. Hopefully it's helpful for the listener. And we'll be back with folks in a couple of weeks, you and I together again, talking about something else. Not sure exactly what it'll be. But I really, again, appreciate you being my interlocutor and pushing back, but also leaning in. And thank you so much for your willingness to be a part of this project.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. I run almost exclusively by myself these days, so it's good to have somebody else to talk to other than myself or one of my young children.
Well, you have hundreds at least who are listening to you now, so maybe someday it'll be thousands, but for now it's hundreds. So
no, this is great. Thanks, Steve.
Yes. All right, y'all. Thank you for joining us, and again, Godspeed, and we'll talk to you soon.